Okay, welcome to the Future Print Insight session. I've got joining me today David Reid, who is the Global Sales Manager for Digital Inks for Sun Chemical. Sun Chemical, one of the world's largest producers of inks. So what we're going to do today is, we had a really interesting conversation the other day in that various markets around the world are responding differently, and various verticals in different markets are responding differently. And who better to ask than David, really, because he's got a global perspective on ink sales, and where ink is being used more, one would think the natural thing is the markets are moving. David, you're going to give us a kind of whistle-stop tour of the world of print as we are today in June.
Yep.
That would be great to hand it over to you then.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. You know, I think it's a very, very complex, a complex area that we're looking at. You know, we've got so many things that take a play on how these markets are changing right now through this pandemic. You know, and we've got geographical limitations, we've got the market limitations themselves, and even down to the supply chain as well. So certainly by geography, you know, within China, it's one of our key markets as well. And we really saw obviously the first effects of the pandemic in China, springing back to into January. We were concerned about it when we first heard about it, but I guess none of us could really see what was going to happen from then. But as you know, China has the Chinese New Year at the end of January. We were all expecting the normal shutdown for 7 to 10 days. And really, during that time, we saw that restrictions were getting heavier and heavier. And really, that 7 to 10 day lockdown for Chinese New Year really ramped the whole way through February. And with a very, very small exceptional cases of ink that could be delivered or had to be delivered, it really was a complete shut off of everything in China, apart from essential food supplies, essential medical supplies. I don't think the world had ever really seen anything like that. But really from then, we found towards the end of February and into March, depending on the market, so wide format graphics, as we know, was going to be affected quite badly by this type of pandemic. And people still being on lockdown, movement of people was going to be very restricted. Obviously, wide format graphics is focused on mass gatherings of people, which is going to be restricted in these times. But coding and marking areas, so that is linked to food production and basic perishable goods and so on, including medicines. That market really continued on unabated throughout the period. We actually saw quite an uplift of business. Obviously, there was a lag of a month that nothing could really be supplied. So then we had this immediate peak come the beginning of March, and that has stayed very, very strong since then, right up until now, and we don't see any cessation in that. So that was one area of our business which remained unaffected really in China. But obviously, wide format graphics was quite severely affected at that starting point. The one thing I would say, and maybe it's an encouragement for the rest of the market throughout the world, is that China has bounced back really strongly in wide format graphics. It's not back to where it should be, but it has bounced back probably quicker than I was expecting, and many people were expecting in China, which is good news. So.
Cool.
If we move on, obviously USA, next big market. USA felt the effects of the pandemic much later as a geography than most other places. So obviously it moved from China, and then really the next market was Italy and Spain and France and Germany and the UK, and then sort of sprung over to the US. So the effects were, I guess, pushed further back for the US, but we're actually seeing the US starting to bounce back, and again, even in wide format graphics, it's starting to bounce back again, probably quicker than we would have expected. which was quite interesting.
Does that does that tend to happen in your experience with the US tends to get bounce back generally quickly from economic kind of pressure or recession?
Whether it's down to the stimulus factors that are used in the US, but certainly it seemed to be a very quick rebound in the US, which probably surprised us, particularly based in Europe, and we see what's happening throughout Europe.
Yeah.
I think the slowdown has been more gradual in Europe, and we see the ramp back up again being a little bit more gradual. Of a slower ramp back up again. So yeah, don't know exactly why. I guess very strong economy, very focused on getting things moving in the US. It has bounced back quite strongly.
Interesting. Okay.
In Europe, again, a very, very mixed bag. Obviously, we saw Italy switching off very, very quickly. And I think that started to really be a concern throughout Europe. Once we seen what was happening in Italy, we could see that was probably coming our way. And we could just see it spreading out. Obviously, into Spain was next, and France and Germany and the UK. So I guess our bets were spread a little bit more across Europe, which is maybe why we're seeing more of a slow downturn and then a slower upturn, because we've got every economy is just working at a different speed and a different switch off time and a switch on time. But I do believe that's going to be quite a slow recovery, particularly in wide format graphics. Again, anything associated with packaging has performed extremely well through this period. So,
across the board with packaging, you mentioned coding and marking, labeling, but packaging, for digital, what kind of markets are strong then?
Well, into obviously corrugated as well. I guess I picked on labels and coding and marking because perhaps the two most established areas in the digital print world, and some may question whether coding and marking is packaging, but I certainly count that as most packaged goods, perishable goods, will have an expiry date and a sell-by date, and it's actually one of the most reactive markets to all of this pandemic, because it's right at the point that you're packaging those perishable goods. So we see that switching on and off much, much quicker. But it didn't really switch off for coding and marking. It stayed very, very, very strong. If anything, it was stronger than normal throughout that time.
Yeah. And you mentioned corrugators. Obviously, people are sort of either at home ordering, but equally getting product into shops quickly is an important thing. And I guess that's where that increase in demand in corrugated has, dare I say it, benefited.
Yeah. And obviously, so many things are now being delivered online. I'm not too sure how much of that would actually be digitally printed, because a lot of it is quite plain packaging that arrives at your doorstep. But I'm sure that the corrugated industry in general will have benefited from that. And I know from speaking to my colleagues across the rest of Sun Chemical, anything associated with packaging has probably seen quite a considerable spike over the last 3-4 months. It's been a very, very strong area for us, both analog and in the digital as well.
Yeah, right. And would you will that continue, or is that a spike related to just people buying more, or you think it will continue?
I think it will continue to a certain extent. When you look at some of the, some of the market research on where people spend their money on a weekly basis. So I know the Office for National Statistics in the UK, their analysis is that what you spend on food, about 30% of that under normal circumstances is spent eating out of the home. Now, obviously, if you can't eat out of the home, that means you're eating in the home. So there's an immediate gain for packaged food, packaged goods. So I think you can see, obviously it's not going to be a 30% increase because it's more expensive to eat out. But even if that represented a 10% increase in packaged food, you can see how that will translate through everything that you bring into the house, that you're not investing your money elsewhere, and in I suppose, services and sporting events and things like that. Everything is now home based, so people have more disposable income to spend on, whatever they want to order this week from Amazon and so on.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It has become much more, and I guess in the UK the retail started beginning to open again.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see then if wide format responds, or point of sale responds to that. And I guess we won't really know for a couple more weeks, but you would hope that you will see more wide format and an increase. And it's interesting you said that you think wide format's further behind in Europe than it is in the US and China in terms of recovery. Yeah.
And again, it really comes down to the geographical basis. I think the UK has been hit particularly hard, and we can only now start to see the UK government wanting to do more about getting people back to work, getting businesses open and so on. That's only starting now, and you can see them trying to bring it forward a little bit from where their initial plans were. But elsewhere in Europe, things like Scandinavia didn't face the same lockdown pressure, so we ink sales and consumable sales in Scandinavia and have less of a climb back up, because they were less impacted right throughout the whole period, simply because their lockdown wasn't as severe, so people were still allowed to move around a little bit more.
Yeah, that makes a difference, doesn't it? And then, and Germany's, how's that faring in your?
Germany, again, it sort of sits in between everyone else. You think of sort of Italy and Spain, and the UK have been hit particularly hard. Germany didn't feel the same. Germany's been reasonably robust through this period. I'm not saying it's not unaffected, because it is certainly affected, but it has been, I guess, somewhere in between the Scandinavian countries and those worst hit, like Italy, Spain, and the UK and France.
Okay, so we've talked a lot around the kind of packaging and POS, which I guess is the sector of print directly related to consumer behaviour, or close to consumer behaviour. How's whether any of your sort of insight covers maybe some of the markets that are more maybe industrial, or decor, or have you seen much of a change there, or is it less obvious to see that?
Again, actually, it's quite interesting, because things like the decor market, it's a much shorter supply chain, so you're tending to supply perhaps direct to the user of the ink. So the switch on and switch off is, again, more dramatic. Those markets are certainly being affected by, again, people can't do any sort of building work or renovation work around their homes. The wholesalers have been closed down for weeks, so the stock continued to pile up in the background, and you see a little bit of a lag in that effect, because obviously the producers were still producing. Once the warehouses are full, they have to scale back on production to allow time for those goods to move. And again, that just depends on the region as to how quickly those goods are going to be allowed back into the marketplace, and how many building companies and people can get access to DIY materials to utilize these materials.
Yeah, and that's different country to country, I guess.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be as obvious for all the reasons we said. Fast-moving consumer goods, you can gauge them on a daily basis, and they're measured almost, aren't they, publicly? I think in terms of their that's obviously where we've seen the greatest sort of benefit and uptick is those fast-moving consumer goods. That's remained very, very strong. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And any of the other markets? So you mentioned we've covered kind of decor and some of the packaging markets and labels and POS, and I guess, do you deal with the automotive sector or any of the manufacturing industries, or?
Yeah, well, again, we know the automotive sector very well within Sun Chemical and our wider business. That has been severely affected. I think the downturn was already starting to happen in the automotive industry, and I think the pandemic has just accelerated that. quite severely. So again, anything in the supply chain has just been used as the buffer stock, while production just scales down and down all the time. So I think it's very public what's happened to the automotive industry, particularly in Germany. Being probably the key player in that market, has seen the downturn very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
But the downturn was already starting to happen before the pandemic. So pandemic has just accelerated that.
Yeah, sure. The sector we didn't cover is typically quite a significant one for digital is textile. And yeah. How's that faring? It was some difficulties there as well in terms of supply chain and delivery and so on. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. Textile. I guess I would prefer to maybe defer that one to our new colleagues at Sensient.
Yeah.
Who probably have a better answer on the textile market in general. But again, you can only imagine that obviously in textiles, as shops have been closed, and the raw material suppliers and India, Bangladesh, and the major economies that are looking after textiles, when their production starts getting hit, that's just feeding right the way down through the supply chain. So it will be an impact. I guess I hope that people have had perhaps more disposable income that they can spend quite rapidly once shops start to open up again. And I think that's one of the things that we might see quite strong in the recovery. Is that people can't go on holidays, they can't take weekends away, and this has happened for 3 or 4 months virtually everywhere. So there's probably a lot of spare cash around for people, and that's no disrespect, obviously, to the people that have had very tough times and lost their jobs throughout this time as well. That'll be on the other end of the scale as well.
So sort of green shoots then. So you're kind of looking at going back to where you started, really. China, you're sort of seeing a steep incline of virtually matching pre-COVID levels.
Yeah, but
is that and then America's kind of showing similar signs. So there are
I guess what we have seen from China bounce back very, very quickly. In the packaging, coding and marking, industrial areas, they bounce back quickest. Wide format graphics is taking longer, and it's still not there. But the other markets have it's just been a switch straight back to normal supply again. So China, for us has been a great success story, and we're feeding from that information to see what's going to happen elsewhere in the world. I don't expect it to be just as dramatic as China, because China, I guess, controlled the pandemic perhaps in a more rapid, perhaps ruthless fashion than anybody else was prepared to do in such a short space of time. So it was a dramatic switch off and switch back on again. As I say, wide format graphics, we're starting to see those shoots in the US. We're starting to see a little bit of it country by country. We've got analysis for each country in Europe, and we can see each country starting to come back out, but it will be much slower in Europe as well.
And do you, I mean, just aside of ink sales, do you see anything sort of becoming a permanent change because of this? Or is it too early to tell?
I guess the pandemic has surprised me and surprised many people as to what effect it has had on people's lives and people's livelihoods and how we move around and so on. One of my fears is, will it affect how we run sporting events, exhibitions, conferences, and so on? Will that ever switch back on to the level that it was before? And that's obviously a concern for wide format graphics, because it's one of the main purposes for wide format graphics. So my gut feeling is that wide format graphics may never get back quite to that same level again. But I do think it'll get close to it. It will take time to come back out when we have virtually every exhibition and mass gathering of people has been postponed for the next 3, 6, 9 months. I think that is going to have a continuing effect. And people are learning to use, obviously, media like this and video conferencing and so on, and you see online launches of new presses in our industry and so on, and you wonder, will the exhibition and circuit really get back to the same level that it was? I've got a feeling that people might learn to live with a different way of doing things, and whether it gets back maybe to 90% of where it was, and then obviously you still get year-on-year growth from there on in, so it will come back eventually, but
maybe in a slightly different format. Different format. Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? So I think on a number of levels, it's I've heard it a lot about accelerated change and demand for certain technologies, but equally social change as well. You know, so it's changing a number of things. And people think sustainability will come back as a bigger issue once this is over. So yeah, it's sort of, I guess there's some permanent changes that may occur, some of which will be positive, I think.
Yeah. And you know, maybe it is still a real opportunity for digital right now as well, because as everyone sees their supply chain being curtailed, there's perhaps a little bit of patriotism as well, that people want to buy from local producers and support their local community and their local people, and keep the jobs local and so on. I think you see a lot of that around the world. It's being talked about how much effort is being put into it. I'm not quite sure, but it's also showed a little bit of vulnerability in some of the supply chains, and I think that might drive people to towards the digital solution, where you don't have 3 months or 6 months worth of printed stock, and something goes wrong, and you know, right now people will be sitting with 12 months worth of printed stock when they thought they only had 3 months, simply because they're not going to use that stock as quickly. And that starts to push people more towards a digital printing world, where you can buy 1, 2, 3 weeks worth of stock, you can get it reprinted as and when you need to, you can be much more reactive to changes in the market. And so that might be a positive that comes out of this for the digital inkjet industry in general. Great.
Well, that's a positive place to stop, I think. So I appreciate that, David. It's really interesting, and also some positive signs of recovery, and still a tough time. And as you say, it'll take a long time to recover. Europe seems to be less clear, but then that's often the way with Europe, with so many different microcultures and markets and so on, and language and everything else. So, but I'm sure it will come good eventually. So thanks for your time.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. Stay safe.